Hi, I'm Kurt. I am grateful for Al-Anon. I love this. We will comprehend the word serenity. That's where my journey in Al-Anon has brought me, and it's been a long journey. And that's what I want to talk about. Because when I first heard the 12 steps, and the 12th step specifically meaning that, I'm still nervous yet, I haven't calmed down. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to others and to practice these principles in all our affairs. What is a spiritual awakening? I didn't know what that was. Tried to carry this message to others and practice these principles in all our affairs. What are the principles? So one of the things I came across was that there's 7 steps to spirituality. And the first one is a complete absence of awareness and connection to your spiritual self. The second is a recognition or remembrance that there is more than the material world. Third is spiritual curiosity, a thirst to find out more about the spirit and our spiritual self. Fourth one is spiritual exploration and study. Number 5 is developing a spiritual practice. 6, an acceptance of yourself and others. 7 is spiritual maturity. And one of the things you'll hear me talk about multiple times is what's called a dark night of the soul. So it says many spiritual speakers experience a very low point on their journey where everything feels like it's falling apart. This is often described as a dark night of the soul. The dark night of the soul is often triggered by loss. This may be a loss of security, a relationship or loved one, or more material loss such as homelessness or redundancy. So I'm going to tell you about how I got to Al-Anon and then what I've learned and gained from Al-Anon since. So some of my earliest memories, I grew up on a farm in Nebraska. It was a 160-acre corn farm, which is pretty small. It's just a half-mile square. But it was right on the Platte River, which is a big river that goes through the middle of Nebraska. And it was fantastic. It was terrible, and it was fantastic both. We grew up, I tell people, we grew up like Tom Sawyer putting church shoes on just to go to church on the weekends. I literally went to a 2-room schoolhouse through 2nd grade. The hunting was fantastic, hunted with all kinds of different people. They used to bring celebrities out and things like that to go duck hunting, etc. But some of my earliest memories were me lying in the grass by the farmhouse looking up at the sky, asking God why I was put here. Because my younger brother and I seemed like we were constantly in trouble with my mother. And we didn't know why. I mean, sure, we fought and stuff like that. Imagine that, 2 brothers, 2 years apart, out on a farm. Not a lot of things necessarily to do, so we would definitely tangle. But it seemed like the trouble we got in from her was more than was justified. So I would often, so in other words, right off the bat, I had this existential crisis, right? Imagine a 4-year-old with an existential crisis, but that was me. And so what I've come to see is that was my disease, right? So I had this hole in my soul that they talk about right off the bat. So that was the first 2 steps of my spiritual journey, right? A complete absence of awareness and connection to your spiritual self, and a recognition or remembrance that there's more than the material world. So that was me looking up at the sky, wondering what all this was about and what was out there that put me here and why I was here. So growing up on a farm was an interesting experience because there was a lot of isolation, right? So we were physically isolated from people. Going to school, I literally had 1 other kid in my class. There was 2 other kids in the neighborhood. So there was my younger brother, 2 years younger, and 2 other kids in the neighborhood. The closest one lived 2 miles away. So there was a lot of that type of isolation. Plus we had the big space, we had the space of the farm, and then the river that we often went down to was big. So there was, even that feeling that we were kind of small in this big space. The other thing that isolated me was because I had this existential crisis, so to speak, I was very interested in the universe and the world. So, things to do. And my uncle was an encyclopedia salesman, so we had a really nice set of Encyclopedia Britannicas, right? So I would sit and read those. And I got really interested in science and physics and all these kinds of things. Well, guess how many of the people that I knew were interested in that? Zero, right? So I'm doing experiments, and I ended up I was really fascinated with the space program, and so by the time I'm in 4th grade, I'm building model rockets and all this stuff. Nobody cared. So I even had this kind of mental isolation even. And luckily along the way, I had some teachers here and there that were supportive and all that, so there was some input into that. So as far as my parents, this was, I'm German. Most of the settlers in the area were, cousins of my dad or myself or relatives. There was a lot of Eastern Europeans, and these people drank like fish. You could go into the cornfields and find beer cans because these guys would have a cooler with them on the tractor or the combine. There was a road that went from a highway around through our farms, and you could walk through the ditches and barely take a step. You could hardly take a step without stepping on a beer can, right? I mean, that's because they were just blowing out of the backs of their pickups as they were driving down the road. So that was just the culture. And there was definitely a couple of alcoholics, but drinking was the norm. And you want to have a good time, go to a Polish Catholic farm wedding. Because there's not one horse tank of beer, there's about 4. And so that was so it was just part of the culture, and even just kind of rite of passage. I remember when I was a little kid at Christmas, my dad would get the lime vodka out and pour in some 7-Up and give it to us kids, it was like, something to do at Christmas. And even that was a social thing for a lot of the farmers to do, was to get together at the local bars or whatever, and that's, when they would talk. So churches and bars were kind of the thing. Actually, on Sunday, when we would go to church and then we would go to the bar, right? So my little brother and I grew up playing horseshoe behind bars in Columbus, Nebraska. So there was a lot of that going on. And I've come to realize that my mother was very much of a martyr, right? And later on, as I'll tell you my story, I found out that the disease of alcoholism is a family disease. And even though my parents, I don't know if they were alcoholics, but our lives certainly revolved around my mother. And my dad was always supporting her. And you could look at the 4 siblings. So my oldest brother, he played the role of the hero. My sister, who was second in line, was always in trouble. She was a scapegoat. My youngest was a mascot, always doing goofy stuff. And I was a lost child, right? So I basically, from not only the physical isolation, but kind of the mental isolation, I just basically checked out and did my own thing. So by the time I get to roughly the 4th, so there's all this alcohol around. It wasn't something like, oh, kids don't do that. They were actually, it was around, it was being offered to us. So by the time I get into 4th grade, I'm literally wearing masks, right? Not physical masks, of course, but the mask of trying to fit in with all these different people. So there was the good student Kurt in school. There was the Kurt that tried to fit in with the other kids. There was the Kurt when he was alone. There was the Kurt that was the son, right? So that was a technique that I even consciously started to develop about that time. So things were going along, 4th grade, 5th grade. But before that, going to church was a big deal because that was when I had a chance to meet some other kids other than just a couple of kids in my 2-room schoolhouse. But one of these kids was this girl named Kelly. And she had jet black hair, these gorgeous black eyes, and age 5 or 6, I was smitten. We going to church this weekend? Yep. Yeah, we're going to church. Great, I get to see Kelly. When they closed our 2-room school so 2nd grade was the last year I went to the 2-room school, they started having us go into town. And as luck would have it, the school I went to was the school Kelly went to. So 3rd grade, Kelly's in my class. This is fantastic. We're buddies. Her parents were obviously in the same church, so, I would try and get my parents and her parents to do stuff together so we could do things with Kelly. And then 7th grade, we go into high school, and we're still kind of a thing, and holding hands and all that kind of stuff. But by 9th grade, Kelly comes to me, and there was a time, I think I was about 7, my sister was getting married, and I was with my oldest brother and sister-in-law driving back from the wedding, and they were laughing, saying, "You're next." And I said, "I know, it's Kelly," right? I was going to marry this girl. I knew that when I was, 11, 12 years old, right? So in 9th grade, I'm 15, and she comes to me and she says, "I don't want to go out anymore. I'm going to start dating this senior in high school." And I was like, "What?" "Yeah, this is what I want to do." And I was just shocked. I couldn't believe it. I thought we were going to be together forever. What was going on in the meantime was my beard came in really fast, and I had really long hair. And when I was 14, right before I turned 15, because I was really good, I had learned a lot of things. I had this motorcycle that was terrible, kept breaking down, and I was constantly in buying parts. So right before I turned 15, the Kawasaki shop in my hometown gave me a job. And so by 15, I was a motorcycle mechanic at this cycle shop. So I was making some money. And when you're on a farm, you can get a license when you're 15. So by the time I was in my, being early 15, I had a motorcycle, and I had my own car, and I had a driver's license. I had a beard, and I had long hair, and I wore my 10-year-older brother's leather jacket that was all beat up, so people literally thought I was 25 or 27 when I was 15. And they knew me at every bar in town because they had seen me with my parents. So Kelly breaks this news to me, and that was the end of my faith. And that was really one of my first dark night of the soul, right? So even though I kind of had this going on, that was when I had lost my faith in humanity. Another thing that happened about that time was, this was when the space program was a big deal. I had built this fantastic rocket, like a Saturn V, the one that went to the moon. It was a model of that. And I convinced a science teacher to let me shoot it off in the school, in the yard. And he said, "Yeah, that's a great idea." So I bring all this stuff, I set it up, and it was kind of a windy day. So I aimed the thing into the wind. And so it takes off, and it goes up, and the parachute comes out, and it drifts right back down about 3 feet away from where I launched it. I mean, that was a miracle. I was so proud. And I remember looking up and seeing everybody around. Nobody was interested. Nobody gave a damn about this whole, I'm going like, this was perfect, and nobody cared, right? So this whole isolation and trust was growing. So it wasn't long before the seniors in high school, I was in 9th grade, and it wasn't long before the seniors in high school figured out, Kurt's got money, he's got a car, he can buy alcohol. So I was off to the races. So that's pretty much what it ended up. So through high school, and I had a checking account. So a typical Saturday was go work at the cycle shop, go to the liquor store, buy a keg, and cruise the mains, tell everybody where the party was, and then they would follow me out, and that's where the party would be that night. I have no idea how many kegs I bought. It's been a lot. And of course it was my money, right? Because that was the way for me to ease my pain, but also, more importantly, as I've discovered, to fit in, right? So I was an early codependent, right? Enabling all of these drinkers, and some have become alcoholics, again, that was just a mask. That was me being able to fit in. And of course, this was the 70s, so there was plenty of other mind-altering things around. And so this all kind of continued in, and actually by the time, it was a bad pattern. So by the time I got 18, I got out of my hometown. And so I moved to Iowa City, Iowa, and I was working there, going to school when I could afford it, and met a bunch of guys. There was a lot of music, and I had been playing saxophone through high school and stuff. And so we started having bands, and of course, you know what goes along with you're in a band, right? The drinking continued. And I tell people, I tried really hard to be an alcoholic, but I don't think I have the allergy, right? It didn't stick. But there was still Kurt, you know, buying kegs, right? All this type of thing, because I was the responsible one with the job and all that. So that kind of continued. So again, it was really just me trying to figure out how to fit into this world, being like I was. I ended up moving to Houston in '85. Same type of thing, ran into some guys. Actually was in a band for a little while. Of course, we were happy that the band made enough to pay our bar bill, right, when we were playing. One of the things I missed was that when I was still in Nebraska, I remember sitting in church one day. First, I was really happy that I had my own car because I could go to church on my own and not wait for my parents. Because at that point, I was still fairly interested in it. And one day I was sitting in church, and the words of the Nicene prayer were just coming out of my mouth, and I was thinking about something else, and I realized that, you know, I'm just mouthing this, what is it I actually believe? So not long after that, I happened to be at a gas station, and this, what do they call those guys with the shaved heads and the orange gowns? Hare Krishna was at a gas station in Columbus, Nebraska, of all places. And he came up to me and he gave me a copy of the Bhagavad Gita and said, bless you or whatever. And so I had this book, right? So I'm questioning all this stuff, and I start reading the Bhagavad Gita, which is the Buddhist Bible. Or no, the Hindu Bible, excuse me. And that's when I got into the second part of my journey, which is spiritual curiosity, a thirst to find out more about the spiritual self. And so I had this different take on religion that was not, you know, of the Abrahamic, right? You know, so like Christianity and Judaism and Islam are all based on kind of what they call the Abrahamic God. And this was completely different. I'm like, oh my God, what else is there, right? This religion is a really big deal. I'm just a Lutheran because that's what my parents were. Maybe I should be something else. So I started on this journey when I was about 17, and it lasted till I was about 35, of reading everything I could on different religions, all kinds of things. And nothing ever really resonated with me. So by the time I was about 35, it was like, I don't know. None of these resonate with me. I don't really feel anything active in my life. You know, again, because I had lost my faith in the world and God and all that. So that was kind of another dark night of the soul, right? That ended past that as I'm just out here, you know, I'm just a speck of dust out in this big, cold, cruel universe. So back to the story. So moved to Houston in '85, partying with a bunch of people, thinking, well, I'm getting close to 30. I should probably think about getting married. And I had dated around, and I met this woman who was gorgeous, and she liked to party with everybody else. So we ended up getting married. Guess who was the codependent in that relationship? So we get married, and she was still working. Right off the bat, she's pregnant with our first son, and I had started a new business, and my partner said, hey, we really want you focused on this business, so why don't you have your wife stay home? And she was happy to stay home and not work. So we have our first son. Things are going pretty good. But at this point, I'm in my early 30s, and my drinking start to tail off. Hers is pretty much continuing. She gets pregnant again with a girl. And about 4.5 months through the pregnancy, we lose a little girl. And my drinking lessens and hers increases. She's pregnant a couple years later, another son. And so by this time, the gynecologist says, look, let's just assume this is a high-risk pregnancy. And at 4 months, he said, I want you in bed, right? I want you in bed rest. And so fortunately, the business I had at the time, I was able to work from home. So this cemented the whole situation of me cooking, cleaning, bills, taking care of the kids, running them around, I mean everything, while she was in bed. So she gives birth to our youngest son. Luckily, everything was fine. And the drinking started back up, and it's getting worse to the point where it's every day. And I come to her and I said, this isn't working. And she said, and we weren't in the nicest neighborhood. And she's like, and we were on the river in the farm when I grew up. Later on, my parents moved close to this little lake, so I enjoyed living by a lake. So I had kind of wanted to do that to give my kids the same experience. So she said, let's move up to Lake Conroe. That's what the problem is. This was obviously before Al-Anon for me. So we go up and look at houses on Lake Conroe. We're starting to get a modest house. No, it's not good enough. The next house, that's not good enough. Not good enough. Not good enough. And finally, the one that was good enough was this mini mansion that was at the absolute limit of what I could afford. And of course, I was the only one that was working. And that was one where I remember closing on that house, sitting in there with a knot in my gut, going, I shouldn't be doing this, but I did. So we move up to the lake. Everything's great for a little while. I'm driving forth to Houston for work, and the pattern had continued of Kurt, taking care of the house, doing a lot of the grocery shopping, paying the bills, all this stuff, right? That pattern had continued, so guess what my wife started doing again, right? She was totally set up to start drinking, and this has gotten even worse. So we lived there for a while, and it was fantastic for her because she had all those people around the lake, right? Plenty of people to party with on a daily basis, and it got worse and worse. So basically, my life became one of just, the weekends, driving, working, trying to make enough money to pay for this crazy house, coming home to not knowing what I was going to find, right? Could be dinner on the table, could be a house full of drunks. She could be passed out drunk, yelling. Who knew what I was going to walk into? I walked on eggshells. My kids got older, and one day I get a call, Mr. Niffler, this is Montgomery County Sheriff. Your son's in juvenile detention because he had an ounce of pot in his football locker. So, oh great, right? So this is starting. About that same time, things were really bad, and I had told my wife, I said, look, if you don't start going, I didn't know anything about AA other than that it was obvious she was an alcoholic, and I said, if you don't start going to AA, I'm going to have to, leave. It's not working for me. So we were having those conversations, and then my oldest gets in trouble. So he's in probation for a little while. He gets out. And then a little bit of time goes by. My wife's drinking gets worse. And I was desperate. I didn't know what to do. I was driving around listening to self-help programs on, books on tape. We had been to family counselors, nothing helped. I had been to psychologists myself, none of that helped. One of the things, though, that happened during that time was I was listening to this one self-help book, and it talked about the concept of original sin. And it said that the foundation of the word sin is sans, which means without. So it's not that we're born bad people, we're born without life skills. And to this day, I remember exactly where I was when I heard that, because it hit me like a lightning bolt, and it was the realization that nothing I'm doing is working. I'm living without any life skills, right? I don't know what to do. So things get worse and worse with my wife, and so I end up moving out. It killed me to leave my kids with her. So I'm living in a Studio 6, and I said, if you don't get sober, I'm not coming back. So this went on for several months. Of course, her begging me to come back, but I stood my ground. And it's obvious she loved drinking. She still loves drinking. So I filed for divorce. During this time, my oldest son got caught again for marijuana. And so I put him in rehab. And we had an attorney who, when my son was in rehab, he said, Kurt, I think what you need to do is put your oldest son in this juvenile drug program. And I said, whatever, sounds good. But one of the things that happened during the first family day when my oldest was in rehab, they had a presentation about addiction as a family disease. And on this PowerPoint, they showed the addict, right, which was obviously my wife. And then they talked about the scapegoat, which was really what my youngest son was, right? I was thinking he was the addict, but he was really a scapegoat, always getting in trouble. And at the time, my youngest son was really being the hero, straight A student, all this kind of stuff. But the biggest picture on the slide was the enabler. And that was the moment I realized that I was part of this problem and maybe one of the biggest parts of this problem. So that was the first time my eyes were opened. And that for all this to change, I had to change myself. The other good thing that happened was when we got into drug court, I don't know if you know any of you from Montgomery County know Judge Mays. He was fantastic. He saved my life. He said, he saw what was going on with the divorce. It was still going on. It was really ugly. And he said, Kurt, I want you going to 12-step programs. And of course, my son, too. He didn't have a car at that point. He was still 15, so I started going to NA meetings. And it's like, wow, this is fantastic. One night, it was in the Conroe Club, and if any of you know that in Conroe, there's the Al-Anon meeting next door. So I'm like, I'm going to go into this Al-Anon meeting, see what this is about. So that night, they did two things. One is they read the do's and don'ts. I'm going to start with the don'ts. Don't be self-righteous. Don't try to dominate, nag, scold, and complain. Don't lose your temper. Don't try to push anyone but yourself. Don't keep bringing up the past. Don't keep checking up on people. Don't wallow in self-pity. Don't make threats you don't intend to carry out. Don't be overprotective. Don't be a doormat. So guess how many of those? 0. Do forgive. Do be honest with yourself. Do be humble. Do take it easy. Tension is harmful. Do play. Find recreation and hobbies. Keep on trying whenever you fail. Learn the facts about alcoholism. Do spend time with others. Do pray. Guess how many of those I had? 0. Then they read the promises. We're going to know a new freedom and a new happiness. We will not regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. We will comprehend the word serenity. We will know peace. No matter how far down the scale we have gone, we will see how our experience can benefit others. That feeling of uselessness and self-pity will disappear. We will lose interest in selfish things and gain interest in our fellows. Self-seeking will slip away. Our whole attitude and outlook on life will change. Fear of people and economic insecurity will leave us. We will intuitively know how to handle situations which used to baffle us. We will suddenly realize that God is doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. Guess how many of those I had? 0. And up on the wall was the 12 steps, and I realized if I did those things, I could have these things, and I was in. The other thing was I had step 1 nailed before I walked in the door because I knew that that my life was unmanageable. I had tried everything I could think of. I was done. I was ready for something else. But then comes step 2, right? I had to be ready to accept that a higher power could restore me to sanity. Well, I talked to you about my journey with religion. Okay, so the universe is going to restore me to sanity? How's that supposed to work? And so, did a lot of work on that. By the way, I forgot, the do's and don'ts have been on my refrigerator for 10 years, and they're going to stay there. So did a lot of work on that, and actually the breakthrough I had was at an NA meeting that I had gone back to whenever I couldn't go to an Al-Anon meeting, and somebody in there was talking about their experience of being in jail, and they were in solitary, and they said that the door to their cell was their higher power. It's like, oh really? Okay. So it doesn't have to be some deity that I haven't figured out yet. And so that was kind of the breakthrough, and so basically what I ended up was that my Al-Anon group was my higher power. For years, I was the only guy in the room. So what I did was I turned, this group of women who have really helped me can be my higher power. But then I came to step 3 and I had to turn my life over to these ladies. Some of them are in this room. But it was a good thing. So this brings me to step 5 in my spiritual journey, and that is developing a spiritual practice. So I finally got through something, working the steps, started opening my eyes to all this, and man, things changed so fast in my life. And it was really interesting because, thank God for Judge Mays and that drug program, I probably would have never gone to Al-Anon. I probably never would have found it. And I was miserable. Not only did it help me with Al-Anon, it got my son help, it got my whole family help, it even actually got my wife help, and during this whole divorce, it took a lot of pain out. So that was something like, every one of those things seemed terrible, but looking back, I couldn't have architected that sequence of events any better than it played out. But I didn't realize it at that time. So I'm going to Al-Anon, this is about 10 years ago, and the divorce is done. My oldest is in college, seems to be doing pretty good, and my youngest, I end up getting custody. So if there's any men that you know of in Texas who got custody of their kid, you know they went through hell and spent a lot of money. But I couldn't have lived with myself if I didn't do that. So anyway, I'm living with my youngest son. He's about 15 by this time, and I end up having to start traveling. So I'm less available to go to Al-Anon meetings. I'm busy when I'm on the road. Things are going really good. I'm fixed, right? Okay. I appreciate this. I'm trying to practice principles. I had worked the steps, and so I thought I had things pretty well nailed. So I'm going along. And then I get a call from, how am I doing for time here? I get a call from Montgomery County Sheriff, Mr. Niffler, we have your youngest son. So I go and pick him up, and they found him with some other kids, and they had been smoking pot. There was none left, so they couldn't get him with anything. And so they slap him on the wrist, which I was not happy about, and they let him go. And I told him, by then I had learned boundaries. I told him, okay, the first time, shame on me. The next time, we're going to go and start getting you some help. And if I catch you again, and if I catch you the third time, I'm kicking you out of the house. So it wasn't long when I caught him smoking pot in the room. So we ended up going into this program called Cornerstone. And what it is, it's fantastic. Kids that are having struggles that are teenagers, they have an alternative peer group and they work an AA program. And the parents, they get together as an alternative peer group and they work an Al-Anon program. So this kind of got me back into Al-Anon. And so that was going good. But then my youngest son, I caught him using again. It's like, you're out. So Cornerstone convinced me to put him in a rehab, and then he was going to go back into an intensive outpatient program. But that's when I had my next dark night of the soul, because I thought I was beyond all this stuff. I thought my youngest son would learn from all the crap that had gone on with his oldest brother, which actually continued with him. And I went into a really, really deep depression. But during that time, and I had a couple of sponsees by then, and one of them said, you really must have had some traumatic things in your childhood to be so closed. And I had never imagined myself as being closed. I mean, by that time I had worked the steps twice. I was really open at meetings and sharing and all these things. So I started asking some friends, and it's like, yeah, you can get pretty far with you, Kurt, but you can't go all the way. There's a wall there. So I started doing some work on that, and what I realized was I still didn't trust my higher power, right? I mean, by this time I had moved on from the women, and seeing that there's something bigger there, and I can start to see some things in my life that are maybe more than coincidence. And in the work I did, what I found out was I didn't trust my higher power. I didn't trust other people not because of them. It's like I didn't trust myself to handle them. And the reason I didn't trust myself to handle them because I didn't think my higher power had my back. And I didn't think my higher power had my back because I wasn't getting what I wanted. But what I started to see was I was getting what I needed. Like these events I told you about when my son was in recovery court. And I had tons of other examples by then. So what I found out is that I can trust my higher power to be unpredictable. And in the things in my life that seemed terrible, they were actually some of the best things. And in my journey, my spiritual journey, remember when I said when I was younger I was looking at all these things? I read a lot of Zen, and there's a famous Zen parable. It's about this farmer. Of course, this is ancient China. And he has this award-winning horse. And one day, the horse runs away. And all his neighbors were jealous of this horse. And they said, "That's terrible, your horse ran away." And the farmer said, "Maybe." The next day the horse comes back, and it's got 3 wild horses with him. And the neighbors are like, "This is fantastic." And the farmer says, "Maybe." The next day, his oldest son, is riding one of the wild horses, and it kicks him and breaks his leg really bad. And the neighbors are like, "Oh, it's terrible." And the farmer says, "Maybe." The next day, the emperor's army comes to draft this son in a war, and they pass him by because his leg's broken. And the neighbors say, "That's fantastic," and the farmer says, "Maybe." And that's what I was seeing was things that were being put in my life were not problems, but challenges I could grow from. And that was step 6 for me, was an acceptance of myself and others. Really, for me, it was an acceptance that everything is exactly how it's supposed to be. I finally understood what spiritual awakening was, right? That everything is exactly how it's supposed to be. That's where my serenity has come from. I got it intellectually, it wasn't in my bones yet. And that's the work that I've been doing, is getting that concept in my bones that whenever I'm challenged, right? Whenever I see something that I used to think of as a problem and still occasionally do, that I look at it or know I need to look at it as a challenge that either I can grow from or I'm helping somebody else grow from. And man, that is powerful. An alcoholic in a joint meeting I went to one time, he said, "Nobody takes your serenity, you give it away." I don't give it away very often. I hang on pretty tight these days. Because once you get a taste of it, you can't change. And that's step 7, spiritual maturity. So I am so happy for this program because I would have been miserable my whole life. I have no doubt. It's beautiful, isn't it? So that's my story. That's my experience. One of the last things I want to say is I also came across a concept called fideism. And what that means is that trying to understand what you believe actually undermines your faith. I spent so much time trying to figure out the mechanics of what was going on out there that it totally blocked me from faith. And it wasn't until I abandoned that. Whatever's out there, my little tiny brain in this giant universe is not going to figure it out, let alone understand it. So I had to give that up. So I don't know what's out there. I don't even care what's out there. All I know is, and one of the things I heard early on, somebody said, you have two choices. You can be miserable or you can accept your fate. And now that I've accepted my fate, I'm happy, I'm serene, and now I love to share. As George said, I say yes, whatever comes my way. When they called me up, hey, Kurt, this was just a couple days ago. We lost a speaker. Will you speak? That's my higher power coming. So I'm here for that. Thank you very much for giving me the honor. Oh, thank you. All right.